In this video, I'm going to be drawing this thing. We're just going to do a simple sketching session. I actually really need to do this to warm up, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit is what are those simple exercises I do when I know that, my drawing's going to be a little bit funny because I haven't drawn for ages. How do we kind of warm up? I'll also try, as we're sketching around here, to answer and field a couple of questions that I've gotten on the channel recently. But before we do that, you got to check out this art book. This is the paintings of J. Allen St. John. Now, I think this is a really interesting art book, and I got into his art because he's one of the artists who I think inspired a lot of Frank Frazetta's work. And I'll also talk about how important I think it is to kind of follow a lot of the influences that your favorite artists had, and how if you go down this rabbit hole, you can often find really, really interesting things. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just a real-time drawing session. We're going to hang out. You can draw as well, or just hang out, whatever you want. We're going to do some drawing, talk about interesting things related to art. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey going from someone who really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free, and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. The first time I heard about J. Allen St. John was actually hearing about Frazetta say that people were trying to get him to create imagery and paintings and illustrations like St. John. And again, that kind of made me feel as if maybe it was going to be a lot older and a lot more kind of lame than actually, a lot of what I found. Actually, one of the things that I think is really interesting is trying to look at the artists you really like, and then even just look at the art that was around or that really sort of influenced them at the same time. And the reason I kind of often like to use older examples of sort of influences, and I go back to these sort of older illustrators, is I think it's a lot easier to see some of these things happen. So it was interesting to kind of go back and look at a lot of the sort of work of J. Allen St. John and kind of see something that was a little bit more sort of classic, a little bit more tame than, Frank Frazetta, but also something that, had a little bit more sort of whimsy sometimes, right? That had a bit more kind of a romantic feel, sometimes a little bit more of a flowy sort of Art Nouveau feel. And yeah, I actually kind of really like a lot of this work. I have another book that is sort of the drawings of J. Allen St. John that is a really sort of interesting book, but this is definitely in that golden age of illustration kind of club. And I think it's just sort of a really sort of interesting look at these sort of different styles. And also, one of the other reasons I like to sort of go back and look at a lot of this golden age illustration is, often it sort of doesn't have the impact of something like the sort of later stuff that you saw with Frazetta, where it had a lot more sort of sexual tension, a lot more violence. But I think these images nevertheless do a really good job of maintaining some kind of visual interest. So J. Allen St. John was kind of really well known for creating a lot of the Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of Tarzan art. Yeah, and I think it's just a really good example of a very interesting mix of stuff that is graphic, right? It does work really well on that, I have to be on a book cover and catch your attention. But, it has really strong sort of shapes. It's also very sort of painterly. And it also has a subtlety and a subtlety with the color and a lot of the composition that I sort of didn't see in Frazetta, right? And it's important to understand, a lot of artists have been sort of very influenced by J. Allen St. John and that kind of general style. So yeah, it kind of lacks some of the impact that you would see with sort of Frazetta illustrations that are kind of similar in some ways. But also, I think it does a bit of a more interesting job at some of the subtler kind of images. And I think it's also a really good sort of look at a style that functions nicely when it is painterly. And it also is obviously something that would, really sort of grab your attention. So it's this kind of stuff that, as we'll sort of talk about, there was a couple of sort of AI questions I was sort of going to address that I sort of got as comments that we might get to. And yeah, I feel like this type of work is the type of work that, not that AI can't sort of replicate, but I think is a good example where you can create art that's sort of very finished and very polished, but still really sort of shows the artist's hand and sort of the expressiveness. And I think this is stuff that people are always going to sort of be interested in. It's this kind of subtlety that I think, again, AI does have real trouble sort of replicating, right? It's always after those kind of apex shots. And yeah, there's sort of just a lot of really good wisdom here when it comes to creating sort of effective shape design, really making sure that you have good sort of graphic breakup with your shots. And if you're interested in creating very sort of dynamic images, right, it's interesting that, a lot of sort of splash art, Magic the Gathering style sort of cards and things that need to have a lot of impact follow a lot of these same rules, right? A lot of these things that people figured out in the golden age of illustration very much can sort of help us today, right? So again, here's like a good example of like people taking the same scene from Edgar Rice Burroughs and kind of creating a different sort of version of it. Yeah, and I think this is like so interesting to also address and look at style. I actually had this book out because I was going to include it in the sort of study session for talking about technical limitations and style. And I think, again, that's like a really sort of good example of how often through style we're, very much interested in how different artists kind of will approach the same kind of subject matter and where that kind of originality often comes from, right? That often is the difference. But yeah, super interesting to see the, what was, I guess, important. I think one of the things that's very kind of interesting is, that often like the designs from this kind of era were very, sort of unrealized. A lot of the sort of monster designs and things like that, it was sort of easy to get away with a lot. They didn't have quite the same level of sort of conceptual design for creatures and monsters. Yeah, but anyway, I think the reason that I sort of bring this to you, and I think it's sort of worth looking at, is you just get such a good example of illustration that has a lot of impact, that has a lot of subtlety, and again, sort of a lot of personality. And it's also quite brushy and expressive, right? We often imagine a lot of this sort of illustration from this era to having, a lot of detail, right? But actually, a lot of it was really just meant to be very functional, to work on a book cover. Often a lot of this stuff got sort of crunched down and, some compressed. So, artists had to work in these and think in these very much more sort of two-tone styles. And that really is a big thing you see is, often the sort of rendering is very much rendered for readability, right? The way that the kind of light and dark patterns on the characters is very much based around, just sort of what reads, what looks good. And yeah, just a really sort of good example of illustration, cover work. And yeah, I always sort of like seeing the ideas that people came up with from these sort of different eras. I think you can learn a lot about visual design language, a lot about, sort of what is unique about the time that you live in through sort of, going back and looking at what, people thought was interesting 100 years ago or more. But yeah, anyway, J. Allen St. John, really sort of interesting sort of point in time. And yeah, just a very sort of subtle, brushy work that is underpinned by solid illustration foundation. All right, so let's do some sketching. Now, I've been writing a lot for the last few weeks. So often I sort of say this, but I literally have not been doing a lot of drawing recently, which is kind of always frustrating. But that's why I kind of like to do these videos, to kind of talk about that. So again, the sort of things I always like to do, I think when we're sort of thinking about this is often if we need to warm up, we're after a mix of sort of precision, right? Like how accurate can we be? And secondly, how can we be loose? And I think often when we're sort of warmed up, right, we have like a good balance of these things. So often if I'm just really like, oh man, yeah, I'm not sort of sure any of this is working right, I'll try and draw some straight lines. And often this is a matter of also trying to join up straight lines, right? Trying to get some control. And I'm often just going to try and draw them at sort of different angles. You know, often think about going backhand, forehand. And what this is doing is just, yeah, keying my eye into precision, right? Like, can I draw a line from here to there, right? Between 2 points. And once I start to do this for a little while, right, I feel like, okay, how messed up are things, right? How bad is it? You never really know until you get in there, because often as part of, you know, I'm not doing drawing, but I am writing with a pencil, because that's often how I do a lot of plotting and stuff, is just sort of longhand. And so often what I find is, yeah, you know, I can, because I'm drawing via sort of making words, it sort of keys everything in. But, you know, the other things I would try and do is maybe some sort of ellipses, right? Just see, like, yeah, how bad is it, right? How bad is it? What's going to happen? And again, that's a little bit off because I'm looking at it from a weird angle. All right, but yeah, just draw some different lines and then try and create some, right, simple forms. Boom. And again, it's just these things kind of give me that precision and looseness. And yeah, and if I sort of jump into it, I'm like, oh, it's not so bad, right? Then it's not so bad. If I'm really struggling, then that's where, yeah, it's time to sort of think about it. And normally what I'll do is I'll just think about like, okay, like, am I actually looking at this right? You know, because I'm sort of looking at it from an angle. This is something I always talk about when I'm doing demos like this. It's actually hard to see the proportions. So sometimes when you do more complicated things, right, it's easy for me to mess up that proportion and make things look a little bit wobbly, right? So is that a problem? And this is where I'll calibrate. Just be like, okay, maybe I need to sit somewhere different, right? Maybe I need to, right? Maybe we need to do something differently. Who knows? So these are the things that I normally do, and the other things that I would normally do to sort of warm up a light. Okay, let's see, like can I draw a simple face, right? So I'd either just sort of draw a random face, or, you know, maybe I'll draw, you know, like a face from a character that I've designed or something like that. Maybe we could try draw Gion from Star Atlas Core. See if I can kind of get his sort of character working. And this just, again, is just something for me to do. It's really not a matter of, you know, the drawing being good, or, you know, the subject being good. It's not really even about the drawing, right? Mostly it's a matter of just warming up, right? Like, can we warm up? Boom. Yeah, and once I'm sort of feeling like, it's okay, then, you know, then I'll kind of move on, right? But yeah, again, it's just a matter of how far off am I, right? Like how loose do I need to be? And we can also start to feel a lot of other stuff happening as you sort of do this, right? Once you've sort of got some precision happening, then again, we might feel like we need to loosen up a bit, or vice versa. And often I won't do this in a sketchbook, right? I'll just do this on a bit of sort of copy paper or something, so that I'm not messing it up. But yeah, that is the basic plan. And yeah, I'll just keep doing that until, you know, I feel like drawings aren't sucking. And, sometimes if I'm recording these kind of things, I do this stuff before I record, but this time I thought, let's kind of actually do that, and I'll see how bad it goes, right? So in this case, again, I'm not sure where his sort of torso would be, but whatever. Again, I feel like this drawing has served its purpose. So yeah, not sure what I'm going to be drawing today. Just kind of like sketching around, maybe some sort of little goblins or something. I think the other thing that's often good to do, if you are kind of starting is, right, let's stay loose, so often the first sort of half an hour or whatever, I'll be doing just some super simple, sort of more gestural kind of sketches, because this is a good way to kind of get into the flow and sort of speed up, right? So maybe some little kind of goblin creatures. So just focusing on being loose. But yeah, anyway, I think I was going to try with some of these art ritual videos to maybe see if I can answer some comments sort of more in general. Because again, I did a video on sort of AI that was a little bit more, I guess, like sort of an opinion piece. There was not a lot of practical drawing advice there. But yeah, I think there was some really sort of interesting comments there. And I thought it might be good to sort of talk about some of those. And the real, like one of the real things that I thought would be sort of good to touch on. Let's see if we can zoom up here a little bit. Boom. Yeah, I thought one of the things that would be good to kind of really touch on was this idea that I've mentioned a few times, which is like we can let the market sort a lot of this stuff out. Like when we're looking on the internet, and if you're, let me know in the comments down below whether this is actually something that, a lot of, you're spending a lot of time thinking about. But it's easy to kind of get sucked into the drama of, AI and career stuff, and is this the end, and will there be any artists, and certainly it seems like, if that video that I made on AI is like any indication, there's like a huge number of people who are just dedicated to this idea that art is over. There's not going to be any sort of jobs or sort of anything happening, right? It's the end of the world. And it's so easy to go down the dark rabbit hole of that, right? And really get sort of attached to it. And I can see there's a lot of people who are really, sort of dedicated to that cause, let's say, in the comments. But there was also some really good comments talking about how, like, people actually were artists and they're working in the gaming industry, and, they've been using AI, right? And there's probably a couple of different ways that people tend to do that. I think one of the sort of comments was mentioning how they were essentially training their own, a custom, I think it's like a LoRa model, like Stable Diffusion. So it's like a custom model they're sort of building and designing, that's kind of has some sort of stylistic input. And I think my sort of basic comment was like, yeah, I kind of tried some of this AI image stuff, but I've never really used the sort of paid services, and I'm probably not doing a good job of it. And I think a lot of people comment and say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, right? It's a lot better than you kind of imagine, and all that kind of stuff. And people were talking, I think one person made really interesting comments talking about how, they've basically been using it professionally, right, at their work, and it means they can get a lot of stuff done, and, ideas are the most important. Ideas are, a lot faster now, and, this means that the design process is more effective and stuff. And I think what I sort of said that I guess is one of the main messages that I think is worth sort of repeating is that, like, just because it's happening and just because people have lost their jobs to AI and just because some companies are sort of deciding to do a particular thing doesn't mean that is going to succeed. And this is one of these things that's so important to understand, is when you have these hype cycles, when everyone gets sort of really invested, again, you have the technology on one level, and the other thing that's important is like, well, is this actually going to be used? And I think because there's a lot of money in like AI, and there's a lot of hype in AI. I think a lot of people have, fired a bunch of people, and a lot of people have made, significant, they put a lot of effort in, a lot of stakes have been put in the sand, right? To say, hey, this is it, we don't need people anymore. We're sort of in the, next generation, we're sort of tech savvy. And I think there's a lot of pressure often to do that when companies are in trouble, or, when they want to be seen to be sort of tech positive or whatever. But yeah, we can sort of step back from that, right? And just look at it from first principles a bit more, which is just that just because a company has stopped, letting people just sort of draw because, they want you to use AI and, that doesn't mean that's going to work, right? There's no proof that is going to work. And I've seen a lot of hype. I've seen a lot of YouTube videos. I've seen a lot of stuff. I have seen a lot of people, actually sort of using it for, work. And, again, I'm sort of pretty well connected to what people are doing and what the capabilities are and where it is and where it isn't. I don't think I'm sort of separated from that. And what I'd say is just like that is yet to be written, like how effective that whole thing is going to be. And you just have to remember that it's just words, right? We haven't seen games that are designed. We haven't seen things that are designed with this that everyone's buying, right? We haven't seen the actual use case scenario. And this is where a lot of the other discussion around AI sort of comes from, is we haven't seen any revenue from the AI investment yet, right? There's very little actual sort of revenue. And, we may have seen some from OpenAI, right? Because people are actually paying for those products. But yeah, the amount of money that has been sort of put in versus the amount of money that's coming out is non-obvious. And so what I sort of said in response to that comment was like, that's really interesting, because I think it is super important to hear how people are actually using it. But just because that's happening, that doesn't mean that that's a good product, or that that's going to succeed. Because the bottom line is that, the budget for concept art in a film, right? If you have like sort of $100 million budget for a film, or a video game for something, and it could often be like 200 or 300 million, right? For one of these sort of big products, the question is like, well, what percentage of that is concept art? And, you still have to employ people to kind of make that sort of work. But, I guess the idea is like, what is the most effective concept art phase for a product? And again, just because people are doing it doesn't mean that that's going to work, right? What's important to understand is, that the delta between a AAA game that costs, $100 million to make or even more, like there's a lot of these games that get made and through nothing to do with AI, right? Just because they don't work, right? They fail, right? And you can see that with a lot of video games that are really good, right? They've obviously had a lot of talent, a lot of concept art, a lot of production, a lot of development, a lot of everything, but no one buys it. And if you're not in that upper echelon of sort of achievement when it comes to a lot of these products, you don't make any money and your studio goes out of business really quickly, right? It doesn't last long. It's not this kind of thing where you get to try or mess around, right? This will happen, and we will find out whether AI is useful really quickly, right? Because I don't think there's the same amount of Silicon Valley slush fund sort of nonsense happening at the moment, right? There's far less money, and I think people are already starting to question a lot of this stuff. So yes, people can use it in their process. The question is like, to what degree is that effective? And does that actually make the company that's employing that a lot more money? And again, my bet is probably not much. And I still think that for a lot of these kind of production processes, there's two things that will happen. One is people are just going to realize that it's still valuable to have concept artists who are good, and a big part of what will make you good as an artist, and you can see the proof from this, from the sort of digital art revolution, is that studying fundamentals is always super valuable. And having someone who is traditionally trained, no matter what they're sort of doing, like having someone who understands drawing ability is valuable, even if they're a 3D artist, right? Even if they're leveraging a lot of digital tools. What we found is the thing that works the best is if you actually focus on all the same traditional processes that people figured out to use how to draw 500 years ago. And that the more you do that and the more you study fundamentals, the better of a concept artist you become, no matter sort of what you're doing. And I think that fundamental equation, I don't see any, I see more evidence for that than, the sort of AI taking over everything. And that's just that, the important thing is still the foundation. The important thing is still having the ability to kind of create it from scratch, and that's what will kind of tend to produce the most creativity and the most sort of interesting ideas. And, I don't see any sort of real evidence so far of that sort of going away. But again, if you believe the internet, that's definitely all going away. So I think the real thing to do is to wait for actual kind of evidence. And I think what I said in that comment is, I think this will be a really quick finding out process, right? Because we're going to see really quickly whether or not companies that are actually using AI are going to succeed in the marketplace, whether they're actually going to make a better product. And I think at the bottom line is everyone is very quick to, bash capitalism, but, capitalism is going to figure this out in a really, really interesting way. And I think what will happen is you have the concept ideation part of the process. And I think what people are going to realize is whatever produces the best ideas is going to win. And I think AI is just not that good at creating original ideas because it's built on a distribution of generalized ideas, and sort of creating what everyone sort of wants, right? Which is often not what you actually want to do. You need to be a little bit more creative than that. And again, if you're creative, if you're missing by 1 or 2%, you lose all your money, right? So you invest $100 million. And if you put a bunch of monkeys who don't have good creativity in charge of what all the design looks like, it means you have a video game cover that you spent $100 million making, another $100 million promoting, and it's got some character that's designed by AI on the front. And unless that is a better design than the next game, right? Game B, that's had the same amount of money, except they just invested a little bit more in, concept art that wasn't AI. If this one is, 2% better, this wins, and it makes, $1 billion, and this makes $20 million, right? And that's what happens, right? That's the market. That is the beauty of capitalism, insofar as there is a beauty to it. And I think it's important to always remember that there's all this talk, but this is what we'll actually figure it out. And what history has shown me in general is that for a lot of things, it's the fundamental attention to detail and technical sort of process that often makes the difference here. But that's not always the case. There are a lot of sort of industries like fast food and that kind of thing where sort of junk tends to win. But yeah, we will see, right? A lot of that has to do with sort of cost base. Who knows? But yeah, I think when we're looking at this industry, I think that's very much more likely to happen. If we're looking at the production side, I think all that will happen is we will sort of stick around the same sort of budget capability, and you're just going to see the delta in quality increase if AI is in any way, shape, or form helpful with production. So hopefully that makes sense. So that basically means that I think there's still like a 10x or 20x increase in sort of visual quality we could easily just imagine with most video games or films in terms of VFX and the quality of what could be done. And once you increase like the production quality and you realize, oh, there's all these other things that are possible story-wise, like superhero films are a good example of that, which is like, previous to there being enough VFX to kind of support superheroes was a terrible movie idea because they all looked awful. But as soon as you have you can spend $300 million and you can actually get a decent production happening, and we can make these suits not look silly, all of a sudden that idea becomes very interesting, and you get a lot of movies that are very much based around VFX, where that just simply wasn't possible before the technology was there. So I think once you see the possibility, if AI can help with production, I think all it's going to do is just push quality up. And I would imagine the same, if not more, people end up being employed. Again, that's a very Pollyanna view, but there's no reason to suggest that that's not going to happen versus any of the other doomsday scenarios. And I think it's just always important to remember that you have to sort of look at what actually happens, because people said all sorts of things in the past. So I guess that's sort of something that is sort of worth mentioning. Again, let me know how that kind of lands in the comments down below. I feel like some people are really attached to, you know, the doomsday kind of nature of it. But yeah, I think with a lot of these things, again, you know, you have to have some level of sort of positivity, because we don't know, right? And you can sit there worrying about things we don't know about forever. But yeah, we probably will sort of find out. But yeah, a lot of this is also really interesting, is, you know, you have to understand which bit of YouTube you're in. YouTube will just sort of feed you stuff that it thinks you want. And, you know, in many cases, there are bits of YouTube that are just talking about how AI is hype, right? And if you get into that, those are the only videos you will sort of get fed. And if you get into the world is over because of AI bit of YouTube, it will just feed you that kind of fear-mongering stuff all the time. And yeah, I would suggest, yeah, getting in the right bit of YouTube. Because the other thing that's sort of worth talking about here, the other sort of AI thing that maybe we could sort of talk about briefly, is this idea, which again, this is the other thing that will kind of be said, is like, you have to adapt now, right? Like, so many comments in there were just sort of saying like, you're an idiot, you don't understand, you're either gonna, you know, it's like adapt or die. And I think it's so important to understand, again, this is a theoretical argument that people are having. And it doesn't actually have a lot of, actual reality to it either, right? Again, there's not really any evidence for that. When something does succeed and everyone who got on it does really well, then obviously everyone's like, well, you know, I should have seen that coming. But the number of things and technological advancements that people get onto and they don't go anywhere. And again, like, you know, sort of Web3 or blockchain for a lot of people is a good example of that, where now they're like, oh, that was a silly idea. But, you know, everyone was saying for a long time, if you don't get into, you know, these things, if you don't buy this stuff now, you're going to sort of miss out, right? And, you know, then when it was doing well, everyone's like, yeah, that's right. You know, look how smart I was. You just literally don't know how these things are going to go. The survivor bias is absolutely crazy when it comes to technology, right? And you just always got to remember that. So the other sort of thing that I kind of say is like, you know, first up the hill often gets a bullet, right? There's often massive disadvantages to early adoption in terms of you wasting your life on stuff that doesn't go anywhere. And if you early adopt on everything, you will just quickly never actually sort of build a lot of core competency. And I see that's what a lot of people sort of end up doing. So there's massive dangers to being an early adopter in a technology curve. And I'd say especially from an artist's point of view, this is super important to remember. My advice is always just wait for the technology to mature. Basically, if you think about this from a risk basis, right, you're sort of going from sort of left to right. If you think about sort of the adoption curve, right, if here's kind of the start, right, and here's where sort of like everyone is using it, right, like everyone in the world is using a tool, you know, for sort of process or technology. Again, something like ZBrush might be a good sort of example. It's not a perfect sort of example, right? But, you know, very early on, everyone was using ZBrush and 3D, who was really sort of in the know, but, you know, it wasn't sort of taught at school. And if you sort of picked up ZBrush early on, yeah, you're going to learn a lot of competency, but you're also going to spend a lot of time dealing with, you know, sort of early software, early computers. You know, unless you're in a real sort of industry or you're a real sort of person who's going to be able to take advantage of that early adoption, you know, it's maybe not going to turn out that well. The longer you wait for technology to mature, right, basically computers get cheaper, they're easier to run ZBrush, ZBrush gets better, ZBrush gets easier to use. A lot of the early adopter tech that you would have learned really early on, like adopting to 3D as a workflow, a lot of that becomes deprecated, right? And now we have better processes for doing all those things. And, you know, it's a lot easier to use. So basically, the longer you hold off adopting to something like 3D as a process workflow for a concept artist, Or the other sort of thing would be AI, right? Like the longer you hold off, if you say, well, this is inevitable, it's like adapt or die. It's like, yeah, well, let's wait 10 years because what's going to happen in 10 years is AI will get a lot better, a lot easier to use. All of the techniques that are being used to, figure out how it works now are completely irrelevant. If any of the doomsday scenarios do occur, it'll change up all the equation and all the ways that you're sort of learning how to use it in the first place. So there's very little advantage to being an early adopter to technology unless you're specifically placed to take massive advantage of it. And often, unless you're owning a company or you're sort of really able to capture that energy and sort of spin it into something, as an artist, you're just going to be sort of on another technology treadmill to kind of figure out how these things work and, how best to use them and what programs to use and all that kind of stuff. So again, if you find that fun, do that. But if you don't, I think it is a real error in strategy from a career standpoint to go adapt or die. I need to kind of learn this thing, even though no one's really using it that much in production. It's not very good. And it's obviously, super buggy, and the way that it probably will work will be completely different to the way it's working now. So that's, again, super pragmatic. Not about ethical or legal concerns, but I think that's something to always remind yourself. Because if you're on the internet, right, and you get these sort of comments, there's a million of these comments, and they're all just like, adapt or die, you in 5 years, it's all going to be like this. It's just important to understand that's not actually how things go when it comes to technological adaptation, at least from my sort of experience doing this, right? It's actually much more effective to wait and focus on your fundamentals. Because again, in the early stages of technology adaptation, and actually learning to use 3D or ZBrush as a 2D artist is very hard, right? The tools aren't developed yet. It's a lot harder to do it. The longer that 3D for concept artists as a tool has been around, the easier it's been to use, the cheaper it's been to use. If you understand form, anatomy, how to be a concept artist, it's very easy to just pick up those tools and apply them to your process because they're now easier, cheaper, faster, stronger. And this technology always becomes easier to use and more effective the longer it goes. And as I said, you frequently see all the stuff people learnt really early on, getting used to those sort of tools, now doesn't apply, right? The processes are completely different. So anyway, it's always worth remembering these things. And I'm sure people in the comments sort of still call me a Luddite or something like that. But that's totally fine. This has been my approach and it's kind of worked. And I'm just sort of putting that out for what it's worth, let's say. So anyway, just doing some sketching, warming up. I think that's probably sort of all we got time for. I did want to just sort of address those questions and sort of add a little bit more sort of context there. And bottom line is just don't worry about the AI stuff at the moment if you're sort of freaking out about it. It's very hard to know sort of how it's actually sort of going to pan out and be used and how it's actually going to influence this industry or any other industry. There's not really a lot of evidence for that. But anyway, thanks for hanging out. Let me know if this was sort of interesting, whether talking about AI is kind of ruining the vibe of doing some cool sketching, or whether answering some questions or comments like this might be a good way to go for these art ritual videos. But other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.